This is the Pioneer GrowingPoint Agronomy Podcast.
Welcome to the podcast that talks everything agronomy and only agronomy, tackling current agronomy topics, management strategies, and covering topics generated from our listeners.
On this episode, we will discuss early harvest results and fertilizing based on crop removal.
And now your hosts, DuPont Pioneer field agronomists Josh Shofner and Brian Buck.
Well, Josh, we got some beans out of the field so far, but there's quite a few still out there due to some rainfall events. We've had quite a few of them actually here over the last couple weeks, and it's getting pretty wet out in the fields.
Yeah, I think the two big headlines the last 10 days was early soybeans harvest got going and yields were really exciting overall, Brian. Some really strong yield results on the early beans, which we'll discuss a little bit here in a minute. But I think the main headline is just the wet weather that we've had in southeast Minnesota. You know, the 4, 5, 6 plus, 10 plus inch rainfalls, and really kind of lining the season up to be one of the wettest growing seasons we've had on record.
Yeah, I found it interesting. I saw a tweet come out of Waseca, out of the research station there, and they said it had been the wettest growing season they had on record, and that was the day before they had the 10-inch rain or whatever it ended up being total. So you think about that, that's pretty significant in a growing season to have, it was 35 inches of rain, I think, that day, plus whatever they got in that big event. So might be a tough record to break looking long term.
Yeah, so overall, still early. We're going to have a few challenges as a result of that. Obviously, some fields are going to need some significant time to get dried out. Brian, we saw a few fields get underwater. A few considerations there. I think my only main consideration, if you had some fields that got flooded, Brian, was when you harvest those, maybe just keep some grain separate. It could be some storage challenge on fields that went underwater, possibly some ear molds and other things, which we won't get into a lot of detail. That's an entire show in itself, but probably just keeping track of some of that grain that got drowned out and flooded, to keep that separate just in case you have some challenges trying to get that grain moved down the home stretch here.
Yeah, and it varied. When you look, there's probably not a ton of acres that were truly underwater. I think the biggest challenge has really been just getting the crop out of the field now. So when it is ready to go, we'll get out and get it, I'm sure, though. So, Josh, you mentioned a little just some of the early soybean results that have come in. And, I think most of the soybean maturities that have come out, there's some 0.9s, some 1.1s, maybe a field or two of 1.4, 1.5s. And so far, so good, I think, or good on the beans.
Yeah, so far I've been really encouraged what I've seen, partially from following Twitter, but also talking to some of the Pioneer sales reps in addition to some growers out there, seeing a lot of 65 plus field averages, in some cases some fields pushing the 70 bushel mark, yield monitors up in the 80, 90 bushel range in some of the good parts of the field. But I would say I'm extremely encouraged what we've seen so far on the early beans. Soybeans, Brian, are always a challenge to look at them and say, hey, what are they going to yield, not going to yield? But certainly for how good the beans have looked, in my opinion, the early results should just be a start of things to come, and hopefully it continues through the Group 2 beans as well.
Yeah, if you look at the growing season for soybeans, anytime we get really good August rains or consistent rains, we tend to get better bean yields, I think. The one nice thing this year is it was warm enough where I don't feel like we had as much white mold pressure as we did in past years. So usually the bigger yield potential you have, the better chance you have for white mold. But we had enough heat this year to kind of hold that back. So I'm pretty excited overall about bean yields as we continue. I would expect them to stay right up, really good all the way through fall.
Yeah, I totally agree. And just not a lot of stress on the beans this year. And I think that's going to be the ticket for having some big yields. So, Brian, whenever we talk about big yields, we also got to be thinking about crop removal and how much crop nutrition we're taking away, how much fertilizer are we removing with big bushels. And I think it's important to review that a little bit, Brian, as we think about fertilizer prices versus what am I going to do for fall fertilizer, specifically phosphorus and potassium. But let's just talk a little bit about removals, Brian. If we look at a 50 bushel soybean crop, that's going to remove about 60 pounds of K2O, which equates to 100 pounds of potash, or OO60. If we look at that same 50 bushel in regards to phosphorus, that's going to remove 36 pounds of P2O5, and that equates to 78 pounds of DAP. So again, that's kind of a simple maintenance program, Brian. When a lot of people ask us what's maintenance, we're usually throwing out 100, 125 pounds of potash and around 80 to 100 of DAP. But when we start talking about these bigger beans, 70, 80 bushel beans, Brian, that changes that equation quite a bit.
Yeah, so just to put it, in perspective, so you talked about the 50 bushel beans. If you look at 70 bushel removals, at 70 bushel beans, K2O is around 84 pounds of removal, which equates to around 140 pounds of potash. P2O5, or the FOS, is around 50 pounds of P2O5, which is 108 pounds of 1846O, or DAP. So you think about that, you bump up 20 bushel in your beans, you need about 40 more pounds of potash, and you're going to need around 30 more pounds of DAP just to get the removal to where it was. And you think about that, maybe you'll cheat it this year, maybe not. You go out and put it on year over year. If you're getting those good yields, you can really start to draw down fertility levels if you don't replace what you are taking off.
Yeah, and Brent, during August, we did a lot of agronomy training with growers. We talked about this quite a bit, and really when we think about P&K management right now and the current farm economics, we're probably not in a situation where we're going to do a lot of building, putting some high volumes out there, but we talked a lot about maintenance, and being that maintenance is very easy to maintain year over year and cost doesn't get too carried away. But if we look at some current fertilizer prices, Brian, you and I you just kind of getting a feel for what the current market is. Potash seems to be running between about $290 and $310 a ton. DAP running about $440 to $450 a ton. You put that together, Brian, and these costs per acres for maintenance on big yields is pretty reasonable.
Yeah, so you think about that 50 bushel removal. If we were going to put back the DAP and potash that we were taking off, it would cost around $32 an acre to replace those 50 bushel beans. Or when you bump up to that 70 bushel removal rate, it's around $42 an acre. So about $10 more is what it's going to cost you if you have those big bean yields to make sure you're getting enough out.
Yeah, so if you think about application from 50 to 70 bushel, you got to take about 2 bushel at, Brian. That should, kind of take what it's going to take to replace 50 versus 70. It's about 2 extra bushel you got to take of that 20 bushel advantage from 50 to 70. Just take care of the input costs and the application in most cases.
Yeah, and there might be some scenarios still where you don't have to go out and put the DAP out. Say you have super high P levels or FOS levels, it might be okay to get past that. But when you really look at just a generalized program, it is good to just know what you're taking off, how you're going to be drawing down those soil levels or building them up over time. And if you're not, at a massive credit in your soil where you have huge levels, it is good to replace those nutrients year after year.
Yeah, so I think that's a good summary here, Brian, to that. Again, you and I encourage maintenance year over year. It's the best thing to do. We at least got to be putting crop removal out there regardless, because Brian, P&K decisions are kind of a long-term effect. What you decide today can have an impact for many years, and if you're going back to corn on that, if you start skipping out, your corn's going to suffer, and if you start skipping P&K applications, at some point you have to make them, Brian. So if you skip it this year, you're going to have to do double next year or triple the next year if we kind of put those out there, and we always want to be thinking about that year over year. Looking ahead, Brian, to corn harvest, a little bit of corn harvest is taking place. Obviously, corn silage, we're probably 3/4 or better wrapped up through that. A little bit of early harvest going on west of us here, but what are your thoughts looking ahead to corn harvest?
Anytime you looked at corn harvest, I think we always, you tend to think of it in too short of a time frame, I guess. It's the whole season that leads up to harvest, and so I like to start back at the beginning and just look at some of the stresses or things that have happened on the corn crop so far this year. Looking back, the first big thing we had a lot of corn go in the ground early in the middle of April in pretty good soil conditions. But then we did have that frost that came this spring and knocked a lot of it back. So we had a lot of 2-3 leaf corn even that got frosted down to the ground. And I think one thing we've seen with that is maybe a little bit more inconsistent. Some smaller plants from that where it was frosted a little harder. And also, I don't know if you'd agree with this, but I think there's been some smaller rooted plants that were the frosted ones in the field. So not completely detrimental, but I think it's something we need to remember looking back in the season.
Yeah, when I think of ahead of corn harvest, I'm kind of really excited to get going, and a lot of for the reason what you said. The corn crop has been through so much this year, from start to finish, from frost to excessive heat to all kinds of rainfall. Obviously, we got some stalk rot potential out there. I think the big thing ahead of corn harvest, Brian, is we got to be out there looking at the crop, got to be looking at those stalks, got to have a really detailed harvest plan in place and really know where you got to go get the acres so Mother Nature don't give us trouble and possibly have some stalk lodging down the stretch.
Yeah, so the best thing, at this point, obviously we need to go get the beans out of the field first, but monitoring those fields is going to be really important for corn. for stalks. But also one other thing, with as wet as it's been, if you do have some husks that maybe held some water, or you had some black layered corn, you might start to get a little bit of sprouting. You might see that out in a field. You're not going to see it on every plant most likely, but if you do see some and there is a field, the best thing you can do at that point is get it harvested just to stop it. Run it through the dryer. That'll kill the germ and take care of that problem.
Yeah, not uncommon to see that in some wet falls. I've seen that a couple times. In most cases, if you get that out early, Brian, the key thing is getting it through the dryer, like you said, and in most cases you can minimize storage challenges that way. But overall, Brian, we've been out looking at the corn crop a lot the last 2 weeks. I'm still really encouraged with what we saw in a lot of the area. I think there's a really good corn crop out there in southeast Minnesota.
Yeah, I'd agree. We put it through some of the early stresses, but overall, anytime we can get the crop finished fairly early like this, and we have plenty of moisture mixed with decent heat through the summer, we're maybe a little short on sunlight, but overall, the crop should be setting up to be very promising, I think. And some of the early results, we've seen some really good corn come in, and I would expect, decent test weights also this year.
Yeah, I agree. I think corn and beans, I see a lot of positives so far. Hopefully the weather will dry up and we can get out there and really find out what we do got out there. So, Brian, I think it's going to kind of wrap up the show for the most part today, and certainly we'll maybe talk a little bit of P&K management on corn harvest, in a couple weeks here when we get going better. But always important to remind our listeners where we can find our podcast.
You can find it you can find it on Twitter. We'll tweet it out. Otherwise, on YouTube, if you search our names and followed by Pioneer, they should all pop up, the previous ones. Otherwise, you can talk to your local Pioneer sales rep and get on the opt-in email list, which is another way to receive them. Josh, my handle is @FarmerBuck1.
And I am @Josh Shofner. We also have begun to broadcast the show live via Periscope, so certainly be following our Twitter feeds when we're going to go live. And that's another good way to catch the show live and maybe be able to interact with us during the show as well.
Josh, that's a wrap for this week's podcast. This podcast is recorded from the Agronomy Bunker Studio in Zumbrota, Minnesota. It is produced by Brian Buck and Josh Shofner. This is a bi-weekly podcast. Thanks for listening, and be sure to tune in next time.